Well, good afternoon. Welcome to MedTech Crossroads. I'm Gene Paranak. Today is episode 91, February 4th, 2022. Good to be with you today. As always, the COVID news from the state of Michigan, as well as some national news, the numbers that we've been tracking over these past many months. After that, today our MedTech in Higher Education series comes to a close, but this is going to be a great one. Today we have Scott Olson and Jeff Stoltman from Wayne State University. We've been talking on the show about higher education, focusing largely on undergraduates and master's students and others. Today we're going to talk about educating doctors about the MedTech industry. You may think that that's not something that needs to be done, but often doctors are so focused on their clinical work and other things that they don't really understand the system into which they fit or the process of innovating within that. And so Jeff and Scott are going to be talking to us about a new program today at Wayne State that is just getting started that's going to educate doctors on these critical aspects. So we're really looking forward to that. After that, time for Q&A. But first, the COVID metrics and vaccine distribution, the data from healthdata.gov. Starting with the state of Michigan, we continue to post this graphic, which shows the relative rate between vaccination rates and spread in the state of Michigan. Obviously, not great news there. Spread is very high, continues to be high. From the standpoint of new cases over the course of the pandemic in the state of Michigan, at an all-time high. The numbers are somewhat sporadic because reporting is not as consistent as it was early, but nevertheless, you can follow that trend line and see cases higher than ever. From a positivity rate, though, a little bit of good news. That unprecedented 30% positivity rate starting to drop off. You're going to see some other numbers today in the state of Michigan that would corroborate that. Deaths, always sad to be reporting deaths in any case, even though in this case, good news, the deaths do seem to have plateaued, that trend line below the three prior peaks. So some good news there, some heartening news. And from the perspective of hospitalizations in the state, hospital admissions, we saw a false summit to the recent hospitalizations. But we're very hopeful about this most recent summit 2 or 3 weeks ago. You're going to see some more on that in just a moment. These new graphs that Health Data has been putting up are really cool because they're showing, in this case, state trends compared to the winter 2020 and 2021 peak. That is, 100% means where were we in the winter of 20? And in 21. And what you can see here is that even though the cases have exploded, the hospitalizations have remained about the same as they did in prior peaks, but the deaths are lower. They've dropped down. The first time around, it was considered 100%. The second time, it's at about 50%, and deaths right now hovering around that 50% of the December 2020 peak. So that is good news, the divergence between cases going up but deaths going down. The public seems to be responding to this also. National daily count of vaccine doses administered by date of administration. Of course, when the vaccines came out, this linear upward trend up to a peak dropped off right about as fast, hovered for the summer, and then slowly crept back up. Since the emergence of Omicron, that seems to be dropping back down. That does seem to be what the data is showing right at the moment. But back to the world of hospitalizations, this time nationally. 4 weeks ago, they were actually pretty low. There were only 5 states that had hospitalizations in that 15+% range. When I say 15%, I mean like 15 beds per 100 were filled with COVID patients. That begins to be an important threshold because most hospitals are trying to run about 80% full. So if you suddenly drop 20 beds out of 100 full of COVID patients, you've filled that hospital up. It's a relatively small margin that it takes to fill that up. And so that's why as you get to the color red, it becomes kind of critical. And 4 weeks ago, there were only 5 states that were in that condition. Last week, this is what it looked like. There were only 10 states that weren't in that condition. But a little bit of good news, we're dropping back. Now 14 states that are not in the 15 plus beds per 100 range with COVID, and fewer yet in the 20 or more beds per 100. So it's heading in a good direction. Time will tell. It's been up and down before, but we want to give you the data as it's collected by healthdata.gov. Also the national picture, they added this graph last week. This is the same as the state picture, but for the nation. You can see the cases, hospitalizations, and deaths at 100% in December of 2020, lower in August, but now hospitalizations have jumped higher, deaths about where they were in August, and cases skyrocketed. So in some ways, what we're seeing in Michigan is better than the national average, because the deaths in Michigan are certainly lower. The deaths on the national scene may be just a little bit higher than the previous average. Kudos to the hospital systems that are putting out these kind of graphics. They don't always update it every week, so we'll give you whichever ones are updated. But as of last week, the COVID-19 hospitalizations at the University of Michigan, 122 hospitalized. You can see the breakdown there between those who were vaccinated versus unvaccinated, and of the vaccinated population, those who were boosted versus not, and for all of them, which had comorbidities. I show you last week's data because this week's is actually quite heartening. Much lower, only 91 hospitalized this week, 10 in the ICU, 9 on ventilators, this at the University of Michigan. Spectrum still wrestling with 321 hospitalized, pretty high unvaccinated percentage there. 70 in the ICU, 49 on ventilators. So you can see the breakdown there. Henry Ford did update their data this week. The split between vaccinated and unvaccinated, a little narrower, 55% not vaccinated, but 280 inpatients in that case, 42 in the ICU, and 25 ventilated. So hat goes off to all these hospital systems that are taking the time to compile this data and show it in such a digestible way. It's very, very good to see. Also, we were really taken with this graphic, which if we can full screen it, if you haven't seen it, it's worth taking a look at. The Delta wave. And again, this is not meant as medical advice either from us or from Henry Ford Health System, who provided this on their Facebook page. But it's a really interesting bit of information here. The Delta wave, things like shortness of breath, cough, high-grade fever, body aches, loss of taste, fatigue, congestion, sore throat, headache, all common. But with Omicron, rare, sometimes. Common. The only things that were common were a cough, fatigue, congestion, and a sore throat, as well as a headache, which makes Omicron look in most presentations a little bit more like the common cold, not even like the flu, which is probably why you've seen the spread in some ways that you have seen, because people just don't know they have it much of the time. So if you're looking at symptoms and wondering, we found this a very, very helpful graphic to pay attention. I'm sure Henry Ford would tell you if you have any questions, contact your doctor. Don't talk to us about it. That's the COVID news. A little bit of local news. The A2 Biosocial returning to the Gather platform due to the COVID wave. Tuesday, February 8th. If you want to get together with like-minded individuals and talk about all things biotech, Ann Arbor Spark and MyLead Consulting and Mish Bio supporting this, but the A2 Biosocial on the Gather platform. You can find that on the Mish Bio website if you want to get in touch. And with that, that brings us to our main event. We continue today and conclude our MedTech in Higher Education series. I am joined today by Scott Olson, who is the Commercialization Director at Wayne State University, and Jeff Stoltman, who is the Director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship Programs. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good to be here, Gene.
Hey, how you doing?
It's good to have you here. Doing well. Well, as our audience knows, we've been thinking with educators about the process of teaching. teaching people who are going to enter the MedTech workforce. And much of our focus has been on undergraduates, and it's been on master's students and even PhD students. One of the recurring themes in that has been giving people open-ended problems, exposing them to things, exposing them to ideas and problems and people, and then letting their minds get working on that. But one group we haven't really talked about, and I think oftentimes we take for granted, is the doctors. Sometimes we just assume that they are what they are. But today, you gentlemen are going to be telling us about some new programs that are being developed to teach doctors about the medtech industry. And I thought this is just absolutely fascinating. So first of all, kudos. Before we get into that, I'd like you gentlemen to tell us about your backgrounds. What brought each of you to the point where you were crazy enough to want to educate doctors on things relating to business and medtech and regulatory and all that kind of stuff? Jeff, let's start with you.
Well, so I've been in higher education in one form or another since 1976. That's how far back I go. And I've had occasions from time to time to work with my colleagues over in the medical school here at Wayne State. They have an interest in the business function. When the DMC went through some tough times there in the late 90s, early 2000s, we had a lot of conversations. And we've had flirtations over time. And I'm always interested. I'm a naturally curious person, but I'm also very interested in making a contribution to the combination of, looking at this from a cost standpoint, but also from the standpoint of healthcare. And how do you be part of the solution to the challenges within the healthcare industry? In the innovation and entrepreneurship area where I sit, we've had students mostly driving that conversation. And I see my role as both cultivating that interest and that appetite in the student, but also being responsive to what it is they're asking about. And so that just kept me, walking across the street, so to speak, over to the School of Medicine to see what was happening. And it's been a back and forth, but crazy enough to do it because I think it's important, and crazy enough to do it because I think we can. And I had a meeting early on in this process that we might get into where the conversation was going around all the reasons why we can't do this. And I asked a very simple question, and there was a very long pause. I said, is it because we can't or because it's difficult? Because those are two different things. And once we got past that line of thinking, that it wasn't that you can't do it, that there's obstacles, yes, but they're not insurmountable. My next question was, but do we want to? Because ultimately, if we want to do it, and it's not something that we can't do, it's just putting your shoulder behind that and pushing. And that's basically what we did. And I'm crazy enough to do that on a number of different levels. So that might be a character flaw.
I resonate deeply with that. I'm one of those people who can't keep my hands in my pockets. I'm always trying to reach out there and touch things that I find shiny and interesting. So, but it's cool because it leads to some really neat things. Scott is also with us, and Scott, you and I have known each other for years in the MedTech community. We'll probably get to it a little bit later, but you were on the show previously, episode 6, way back in the day, talking about VentMI and your collaborations with Dr. Glenn Green on the ventilator splitter. But you yourself, a longtime person in the MedTech community and development of medical devices. Tell the audience just a bit about that background.
Well, so I finished at the Ross Business School, did my MBA in '99, and decided to stick around in Ann Arbor. And I found that I really loved the technology, and I wanted to be in a field that had a lot of drama in it, a lot of confusion, a lot of opportunity, because I knew from my prior life that was a very attractive place to be. And so that's why I chose the MedTech space, because I saw pharmaceutical companies and drug delivery companies not communicating to each other. But I saw the eventual convergence of devices and drugs, and then health IT really burgeoning and changing the way that medicine was being practiced. So that's what made me so loyal enough to stick around and consult. And I really I found passion in working with early stage projects, whether inside large organizations or with startups. That naturally led me to academic startups. And so I've worked with a number of academic innovators, both PhD, faculty members in the health space, but then also with MDs. Then in 2011, I joined up University of Michigan to run the medical device, the Pediatric Medical Device Consortium, which is an FDA-funded initiative, and that the purpose there was to assist people from anywhere with advancing pediatric medical innovations from whatever stage they were. So we had funding to help those projects move along, and we brought together guidance and assistance to be able to enable those to occur. That was part of the overall inside the Department of Surgery. We had a medical innovation program. And that was part of the things that really got me sort of deeply involved. One of the things that we did there was an innovation fellowship program where we took MDs, PhDs in engineering and typically MBAs, put them in teams, and then taught them the innovation process over a one-year fellowship. And that was some of the most interesting and rewarding things that I had done up to that point. So that really was what got me deeply into the educational space.
That's great. And it sounds like both of you gentlemen are people that like things with lots of moving parts. I was reminded, Jeff, as you were talking about Ron Williams, who's the founder of MedBio, a local manufacturing firm that has done quite well for our industry. And I remember I asked him one time, how do you pursue management? And he said, oh, I do management by walking around. I just get up and I go and talk to people, and all sorts of cool things happen. I thought that's exactly the same thing happening there on a creation of these kinds of early stage. How are we going to teach people? Well, I think it's important for us to understand the power of this, what you guys are targeting, because oftentimes when we think about education, we think about the people who will work and do, we're going to do some engineering in the med device space, for example, or we're going to do some project management, or we're going to work in testing, or we're going to work in some very, very, I don't want to say low area at all, but an implementation of things. And we often think of the doctors as being out there, and they've got, they think great thoughts, and they do clinical work, and we desperately need them because we have to understand what their world is like. But oftentimes there can be sort of a wall there where, we're sort of living in different worlds. You guys are trying to change that, which I think is amazing. And Scott, as we were talking before, you had an example of from the VentMI project of a place where you felt like the power of a doctor who was educated about the world of MedTech and the world of business really helped you out. Tell us about that.
So I got contacted by Dr. Glenn Green from University of Michigan, and he was working on a project to create a vent splitter. This was early in the pandemic, and there was growing concern that as soon as a few weeks, they were projecting that we'd start to see ventilator shortages in Detroit. And people who remember the time, that was a huge concern, because if you have patients who need to be on a ventilator and you can't get them on a ventilator, then they die because they're too fragile to be transferred somewhere else. So industry was trying to rapidly tool up so they could create new ventilators, but the driving force behind it was they couldn't provide them quick enough. So Dr. Green contacted me. They needed some assistance getting what's called an emergency use authorization. So I took on the role as the FDA point person. And we got in touch with the team at the FDA that was going to be responsible for reviewing it. And the lead, the young engineer who was the lead, talked to me, and he said, my boss pulled me aside today and said, I'm really glad to hear that Dr. Green is working on this. And I thought, wow, that's fascinating. When he's, his boss is telling him, you got a good guy that you're working with at UM. And of course, now Dr. Green has a long career, and he's been involved in lots of innovations, but to have that reputation precede him, I think actually, I'm sure it helped, our project get the attention that it needed. And in fact, it was just a shockingly fast approval of the device.
That's a great example, and anyone who wants to see more about that, I think it was episode 6 of what is now MedTech Crossroads that you came on. I might have also been up one around that where we had more of your team on. So if people want to go back and see all about that amazing effort that you guys put in, it was really cool. I think
that's part of what drives us today. I think to look at, well, how can we get people early in their career, in their medical career, thinking along those lines rather than having it develop much later in their career. So by exposing them to different aspects of the innovation space, our thinking is that will help prepare them for opportunities that they can recognize and then take advantage of as they go forward.
Yeah, that's huge. And Jeff, you had there was a genesis in your mind for this idea within the I guess the Mike Ilitch School of Business. You had some little inklings, I think, from students. Tell us about that.
Well, it came in waves, and then the last wave seemed to coincide with coronavirus. So early on, and Gene, when we were talking, I didn't go all the way back to the origin story, but the origin story was shortly after what we now know as Tech Town opened up, and there were some really interesting things happening over there. We had a course in the business school which was essentially about commercialization, and we did have a few students kind of trickle over to kind of be involved in that. I got involved with the Office of the Vice President for Research, which is where the tech transfer operation was, but it was all on the margins, really. There was no cohesion to it. And even back then, my take was, there's some interest out there from students and practitioners in doing this, but it's fragmented, and it really hasn't coalesced into a mass that you can identify. And for better or for worse, one of my little tricks is I take fragments and I kind of see the through line, and started having conversations, and that really didn't go anywhere, to be blunt. A few years later, there are some students who are coming out of the Henry Ford Innovation Project who are Wayne State Medical School students who are saying, they're really kind of pushing from the inside. We need to do something like this over in the medical school. So there was this surge of conversation and activity, but frankly, as soon as those students moved on to residency and beyond, it kind of went away. The third wave was a student who just sat in one of the seats in one of my classes in the entrepreneurship program in the business school, who was a medical school student who was going rogue. Much to the chagrin of the medical school faculty, he was over in the School of Business taking a course. But he became sort of that inside provocateur inside the medical school, and it kind of bubbled up again, and then it went away. Now we're going to fast forward to a new dean arriving at the School of Medicine, and he made a kind of an offhand remark in some public setting about he'd like to see some curricular kinds of advancements. And the medical schools made some really significant strides in terms of revising their curriculum and thinking differently. He was kind of throwing out there MD, MPH, MD, MBA. He just kind of threw it out there. And there was this, I envisioned it. I wasn't there, but I envisioned it as a throng of thousands of students who rushed the stage to talk. But in point of fact, it was just a handful of students. But again, the students kind of pushing from the inside, saying, let's talk about that. And so we began a project in May of 2020, just shortly after the world started to fall apart for many people, really kind of looking at what would an MD MBA look like? How can we make that work? There's two very different worlds on different calendars and with different rhythms. And eventually, what cracked the code again was students. Was the idea that within their curriculum, within the medical school curriculum, we would create an elective track. Now, they had already created that space in their curriculum. They had one track around policy. Another track was around, what I would call traditional research kind of methodology. There was another track around community health. This was going to be a fourth track, the business of medicine, an elective track. And we worked on that, and then, in parallel, started putting together the pieces for the MD MBA program. And what makes it different, I think remarkably so, is unlike most of the MDA programs that are out there, and there are some been around for a long time, this is a concurrent program. We're overlaying one program on top of the other. so the students do not drop out of their medical school education for what amounts to a full year to go get the MBA portion of it. They are still in their curriculum in the medical school as they are also outside here looking at the MBA program. And I am in the process right now of putting together the core team of faculty that will include business school faculty, MD MBAs, people who've already sort of put that credential together, subject matter experts from industry, practitioners, to design this curriculum so it's not a vanilla MBA program. The MBA program will be healthcare-atized, right? We're going to have a lot of healthcare content. When we do our cases, where our case studies will be around issues in the healthcare industry. And this business of medicine course has really been sort of that's what swung the gate open, because the roughly 35 students who came into that course really on a pilot basis, and we kind of kept it small to begin with, they have been seeing week over week people from all across the healthcare ecosystem talking about what they do. And I don't think we've had a single session which hasn't ended with somebody saying something like, I had no idea that, that's what happens, right? And the faculty from the medical school and others who've heard about it, we're getting two bits of validation that we're onto something. One is we have faculty and alums that want to be in on the course. So that tells me there's something going on there. But the other piece is they keep saying, boy, I wish I had something like this when I was in medical school. And we've had people who've been out maybe 5 years, people who've been out maybe 10 years, 20 years. And I don't think there's been one of them that hasn't said, this is fascinating. I can't imagine how my world would have been different had I been exposed to some of this as a medical school student going through the process. And Scott's going to kind of pick up the ball here and run with it. And Scott and I have got a relationship that goes back a couple of years now, and it's really productive. The next part of the track in the business of medicine program is solely focused on innovation. We are at the point now, starting next week, in the more general course, we are now shifting the focus to innovation in the healthcare sector. Scott's going to be bringing in some of his network to be part of that, to expose the students to, and we have somebody coming in with a pediatric anesthesiologist, I think, next week, who's a serial entrepreneur of sorts. And Scott can give you a little bit better. And I know that I've got 25, 30 students are just going to be hanging on the edge of their seat. Every time we've had a physician in there, it's like, well, how did you make that turn? When did that happen? Where did that come from? Because it's not happening inside their standard curriculum, right? And so it really is a kind of subversive process. But I credit the students. I credit Dean Schweitzer, the new dean of the medical school, no longer new, but he kind of came in with first of all, just sort of the open statement, and then the willingness to follow it up. And then our dean, Bob Forsyth, really was supportive of looking at this. And you might imagine that universities have a lot of obstacles that they can throw in your way about a program like this. But we're right here. Last Friday, the Board of Governors at Wayne State University gave the final authorization to the program. And so, so we're bouncing down the runway like I described to you before, but we're getting ready to
make the takeoff. But I love your pointing out. I love your pointing out the genesis of it with the student interest. We've talked before with educators saying, one of my most important stakeholders is not just the people that my students are going to go work for, not just the school itself, not just some other random part of society, but it's the students themselves. And I think what's cool is you're listening to that and you're going, hey, what is the student-led interest? To that point, Scott, you had I think another story about student-led interest that really motivated you.
Yeah, while I was on the Innovation Fellowship program at U of M, we had a group of 4 fourth-year students, and that's typically a lighter period in the curriculum because they need to have a lot of flexibility in their schedules to go out and interview for residencies. And so they wanted to effectively do in a 1-month time what we had other postgraduates do in a 1-year time. So we modified it, and they were able to get some value out of it. They identified a problem, which was an important goal of it. And in this particular case, they identified that inserting an arterial line in a patient who was about to have surgery was done with multiple attempts that failed. they eventually got an ultrasound device and tried to use that to be able to guide the insertion. That failed as well. The patient was crying. She was in pain. It was very traumatic to her going into it. And so they wanted to solve that problem. I said, okay, well, first off, let's give her a name. And they said, well, that's private health information. I said, okay, let's make up a name because we got to humanize the problem, and then we could do something about the problem. So we gave her a name, we gave her a profile, we picked an age for her, and then described that situation. Well, they wanted to create a device. And I said, well, creating a device in a month is a little aggressive. So why don't instead we come up with a protocol? Because the protocol, it's done randomly, or it was at the time. And so they took that and ran with it, and they developed the protocol. They got it approved internally, sort of bought in by the people who would be affected by it. And then they got it approved through the administrative ranks and implemented. So a great success for them. One of them in particular, though, said, we need to have this throughout our curriculum. So at the time, there was a program that was just kicking off and just been funded by the government for 5-year redesign of the med school curriculum. And so I introduced the student to the associate dean who was working on it. We had another head and neck surgeon, ENT surgeon who was part of it, who had her MBA and was very innovative herself. And so that student then helped influence what eventually became, as the curriculum redesign progressed, eventually became a path of excellence. And now the program there has multiple paths of excellence, but one of them was in that space of the innovation and entrepreneurship.
Wow, that's awesome. And so they were really motivated by this real situation.
Yeah. Well, and it's very empowering too. I mean, I think one of the things that I've used as I kick off any type of a fellowship program, or especially involving students, is I point out to the students that they have short little white jackets, and that they get them when they start their programs, and that marks them as baby doctors. And it's a reminder to them that they don't know anything yet. They're going to learn a lot, and it's going to come fast. They're drinking from a fire hose. But they're going to learn how things are done from other people who have already learned those things. And the limitation there is that they're not learning how to assess for themselves. They're learning the foundational judgment. But there's another aspect to it, which is the lens that they bring as physicians or as emerging physicians into identifying and solving unmet needs. And that's really the focus of the work that we're going to do in the business of medicine course, which is to help them, sort of tweak their mindset so that they are able to identify those unmet needs and develop them into solutions.
Well, so let's go there. Let's go. We're going from the big picture down towards the what are we trying to accomplish here? You talked about finding unmet needs, getting their minds seeing through a different lens. Jeff, you had a very specific sense of what you're trying to accomplish with teaching in general, I think, but specifically here. There were two things, as I recall.
Yeah. So the first was awareness. The second one was curiosity. And the idea, higher education, I think, has been, in some respect, about exposure. So, we have you read a lot, we have you, write papers and dig into things, but it's very exposure driven. And, and so the awareness of what's out in the world and how different people think and, different value systems and different ways of thinking about outcomes, that's all part of the higher education experience. Now, when you shift into medical school, a lot of that awareness is about the things that they have highly structured here, right? But they realize at some point, I'm going to drop you into the actual space, and you're going to start to experience it, right? And the curiosity piece comes from being in the situation, having to wrestle through the particulars, having to think about the particulars. And I happen to believe that there's a 6-year-old in every college student, every graduate student, that curious 6-year-old that was always asking why, peeling, taking the flower out of the ground to see if they could put it back in the ground. Just that curiosity that is really very critical to our intellectual development. And it just sort of gets pushed out of the system over time. And so what we're trying to do through the program is take their natural instinct, which is to kind of go look and see, and then drop them into the space so that that curiosity thing starts to kick into gear. Um, and you know, and if they, I mean, they're told, you know, all the time that, you know, and it's true, they're very important to their community, to the health of the community, to eventually to, you know, to their patients. We're trying to get them to think another level up, which is as change agents, you know, how do you see where opportunities to improve things on a more systematic level or on a wider scale than, you know, just here with this patient or even just here in this local community. And I'm, you know, taking that ecosystem view really kind of forces them, um, and I don't mean, you know, by gunpoint, but they see that it's a much bigger world, and they get that if we use the, you know, conventional business curriculum, they go from the microeconomics of where they want to be to the macroeconomics, and once they get up there, they start to see systems changes as possible, and that's how we work it, right?
That's
And we go, or using design thinking is another way to think about it. We go divergent, then we converge, but then you know, this is my thing, and then we diverge again, and then we converge again. We can just keep doing that a number of times. And I think over time, what you do is you start to figure out how to be more efficient when you diverge, right? But you still want to diverge. You still want to get out there and see what else is out there.
it's kind of like a breathing process. I love your point about really triggering their curiosity. We've talked before about sort of giving people open-ended problems, but I like how you're putting the focus there on one of the reasons we do that is to trigger their willingness to search, let that inner child sort of get out there and go. I think my inner child's actually only 5.5, so hopefully eventually I'll mature up to the 6-year-old inner child.
So,
But
you know, so the thing is, in a lot of MBA programs, there's a lot of, you know, war story storytelling, and what's compelling about that is, you know, the world has always kind of worked around story, right? And story is very easy to hold on to, and story is very easy to remember, but story doesn't help you live it, right? So the idea is almost make your own story. You drop in there, and you know, and I've seen students turn around and tell other people about what they've done and how they did it and why it's important and what they're going to do next. And I just stand back and say, that's it right there. That's the point right there. It's not for you to remember a story or a passage from a paper, but to be able to make your own story.
yeah,
And
that's great.
they just have to have the confidence, and they have to kind of see the pathway. And I think, you know, we're doing that. And you know, that's a never-ending challenge, but you know, that's what we're trying to do.
I love that. Trigger the curiosity. Scott, what are your overarching goals? How do you think about this? What are you trying to accomplish?
So I want to prepare the students by through the experience, and the experience, much like Jeff described in the convergence and divergence, it happens in context. And so one of the first things that we're going to do is train them how to observe. And that sounds kind of silly. I mean, you stand in a room and you look around, and but it's a little more sophisticated than that. And there's techniques that can be used which don't interrupt what's going on in the situation, but provide a lot of information to whoever the observers are. Typically, we do that in teams of 2, and then outside the room, we then have the 2 compare their notes, because often what they observe is different than what their partner observes. Maybe they were in a different position in the room. Maybe they were standing side by side watching the exact same thing, but one picked up something and the other didn't, or one interpreted something and the other didn't, or they both had the same actual fact, but their understanding of it was slightly different. So that process itself, the back and forth and the reflection, that becomes a really important component, and is one of the goals, because at some point they're going to be, you know, through their residency, and they're going to be practicing in whatever environment that they choose, and so they'll have a situation, a scenario, or a context that they're working in, and I want them to remember and to feel what it's like to observe carefully, and then to be able to know, what do you do with the observations? And there's a process that we use to take those observations in and create something that can be stated as a problem. And then that problem can be tested and validated with whoever the important, the concerned parties are. And that's where we bring in the context of the 4-part customer, if you will, who think in terms of customer discovery. That in the healthcare setting, you have the patient, you have the clinician or the provider, you have the health system itself, and then you have the payer. And so as we move through the process of going from the identified need, a medical need, to proposing solutions, to validating solutions, and then ultimately to commercializing the solutions, we have to begin understanding the different parties involved, bringing them into the process so that when we come out the other end with something we think has viability, we've got heads around the table from all four parts of the customer, and they're nodding in approval to move forward.
Yeah, that's great. It's really interesting to sort of give them that perspective of like, okay, how do I almost permission, I guess. Like there are problems outside of what I'm being taught to solve that affect my life, affect my work, affect where I will work and how I will work. And you're giving them permission and lighting that fire to be like, yeah, you can look at these too. Like this is all fair game here.
Right, and they don't need to know how to manufacture a nanoparticle coating for an implant. There's other people who can do that, but what they do need is to understand how their perspective as a clinician fits and where it fits, and then what do you do with it once you've identified a problem worth solving? How do you know it's worth solving, and then how do you move it forward and bring in the other people who can help bring it to life?
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned customer discovery, which is actually going to be the very next series we're going to do on MedTech Crossroads, starting the week after next. So I think it's really interesting to see how these things kind of flow together. One of the things I did not want to miss while we've still got time on it, and Scott, when you and I first talked, there's a challenge I think for doctors. They're being pulled towards a system that is going to encourage them to, I mean, we've all been to the doctor and we know what it's like. Oh, you need to spend 4 minutes, not 5 minutes with the patient because it's the only way we're going to make a profit off of this, et cetera. Everything becomes very production oriented, if you will. It's very hard to sometimes find the humanity in that. And when there's a lot of money involved, it's very easy to just look for the efficiencies and just turn the crank. And what you guys appear to be doing is getting in at the front end to sort of inoculate and say, but you can look beyond this. But I guess to throw a challenge out there to you guys, how do you do that effectively? How do you approach thinking about doing that effectively when they're up against such a challenge? There's such a culture in medicine. We talk about the challenges of medicine in the United States, especially. We talk about how it can be a very inhumane system. We know that a lot of the drivers are legal and financial and just sort of raw efficiencies. How do you think about, you guys are taking the steps to try to get people to think beyond that, but how do you do that effectively?
I'll go first. So one of the things we're doing, and Scott's been a big part of this, is we're showing them the changes that have already happened, right? So we're bringing change makers into the room. We're bringing, people who were practicing physicians who saw the opportunity and then moved the needle in terms of trying to change. So that one way to do that is by having them interface with people who are doing that. One of the things in this business of medicine course, which we stood up last October, one of the first things I had them look at was a short little paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which basically asked the question, how much of the change that's happened during COVID is going to stick, right? How will the future look different based on what happened here? And we focused them in on telehealth and telemedicine as one big sector where that change was going to land. And then we started bringing in people who were on the device side or the platform side or the within the provider system, the procurement side, right? Looking at, well, what did they have to do during COVID? Well, that's one thing, and that's a very important part of the story. But going forward, what does that mean, right? As this becomes standard operating procedure, no pun intended, right? As this becomes standard, what does that mean for them as practicing physicians if they choose that route? But they can also start to see, well, things can change here, and not just because of COVID. but because people can start to see the results of change, right? They can start to see how much more accessible certain things are and how potentially cost gets driven down over here so that we have revenue available or resources available to invest over here. And they're starting to see that system. And I think that's a big part of it, is seeing the connections that Scott was talking about a moment ago, as those four customer types. The other person or role that we've put in front of the classroom are the producers, or the MedTech device people, the medical supply people, the distributors in the process. They're really seeing the whole system so that they understand, my little lens right here that's focused is part of a much bigger mosaic. And they're starting to see the connection. I've got first year medical students asking questions like, so what's the margin on that? Right?
Wow.
Just like, where did that come from? Well, it came from November when the guy was just hammering. The margins on these are very thin.
Yeah,
I think
that's great, Scott. Yeah.
so. I think that sort of puts the emphasis on the importance of understanding the context in which the decisions get made. You know, whatever their employment situation is in the future, there's going to be barriers. Institutions create barriers. They don't like to change quickly. Medicine, you don't want to change quickly anyway because the potential for safety mishaps. So there's a number of things that are important, but I think are characteristic of the healthcare industry. But having that context and enough understanding to let them know that there are ways to navigate it, I think is important. That's a knowledge component. And then the experiential component of identifying and validating a problem that does need to be solved, and how do you come up with a solution which is worth and is important enough to be able to be matched to that. That's another component. And I think the other reason to bring in people from the outside who've done it, not only to show that it can be done, but to make it aspirational.
Yeah.
We had an opportunity a few years ago to bring in Laser Greenfield, who was a well-respected surgeon who had developed an important filter called the Greenfield filter. And it was a way to capture during vascular procedures or heart procedures, if there was a clot that broke free, it could capture it. And the fascinating part of his story was, where did the idea for that come from? Kind of seems obvious now, but where did the idea come from? Well, he had a buddy who was in the oil business in Texas, and they were sitting around talking about their respective areas, and Laser brought up this issue. I can't recall if he had lost a patient or what. And his buddy says, well, we have that problem with oil sometimes, where you get chunks of it, or you got some kind of a thick, maybe, similar to a clot, and we use this kind of a basket filter to catch it before it can go further on in the processing. And that popped into Laser's mind and said, I'll bet we could do that in the body as well. And that led to a terrific innovation and many lives saved over time. But to watch the students take that in. Now, in this case, this particular team, we had two MDs who incidentally were also MBAs, but for them to take that in and say, so it came from a serendipitous moment, but you were talking about your problem. You knew it was a problem that needed to be solved, and you went far afield, literally into the oil field, to come up with a solution.
It's a really great example, and I hadn't thought of this before now, Scott, but it strikes me that in some ways, what you can do by doing that is give, in this case, doctors hope, because it's a hard profession. It's one that sees a lot of people just wishing desperately they could get out of it, despite it pays well and everything else. And we've known so many times. I got to tell you, the number of like emergency room doctors who will leave it and then go make a startup because they still want to make change, but they can't see themselves there anymore. It's kind of impressive, but I think what's interesting about this is what you're saying to people is you're not stuck right where you are. You can see more beyond it, and how you address that, up for grabs. Some will make startups, some will go into other lines of work, some will work within their organizations to make change. But I think what's so beautiful about these examples that you're sharing is when you show somebody that there's a way that things can be different, somebody has pioneered that way, then they can have some hope in their work and say, I'm not stuck here. I've got options, and they might be non-linear to what I thought my job was, but I can do this. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, if you're ever over in the medical school, you come into what's called Scott Hall, and just past the security gate, there's a little exhibition area where they show a number of medical devices and surgical, instruments that were innovated in that space. And it's a while back, and some of it's rusty-looking material, but I mean, what it does is it hits you on the way in the door that things were not always the way they are right now,
Mm,
and that people in this building, or at least in this vicinity, did that, right? They made that improvement. And I think the nature of the medical science is they're always trying to get better, right? They're always looking for advances. Uh, they're sometimes relegated maybe right down to the diagnostic or therapeutic level, right? But one of the things that we did in this business of medicine course is we just opened it up to the future of tech in health. Just let them see what's out there getting talked about. And they had little glimpses of it here and there. They had no idea, right? They had no idea that all of that's going on. And then starting to figure out how all those pieces connect and how they might change, the care that they deliver to somebody. Whether or not they can get it in to a hospital system would be one thing. Can they get it into their private practice? Can they get reimbursed for it? Those are all kinds of, those are the kinds of things that they're starting to think and talk about now. But as a generation, I would say, and I would say this of any college generation over the, almost 50 years I've been doing this, possibility is where they start, right? They start with possibility. That's kind of why they're there in the first place. So my job, I think Scott's job, and we both take it on gladly, is just keep those doors open. Just keep looking for the possibilities and help them find it. I mean, it's not just go over there and see what you like, right? It's the structured kinds of experiences and exercises that we provide for them that allow them to see, oh wow, I can do this, right? Not everybody's a born ethnographer, but you can learn how to do that.
yeah, that's so cool, and it's so cool what an inspirational job that is to be able to put people into that place to see themselves innovating. I think it's really cool. I want to leave just a minute here. If any of the audience has questions, we've only got about 2 minutes left here in the show. I'm going to let my wonderful tech team here, Steve, tell us if we can bring Ken live to ask his question.
We can try.
Let's give it a try. We're running new tech. We'll see if this goes down in glory or flames. Ken, you might be live.
Can you hear me there, Gene? Okay, so
Yes.
Scott, I remember working with Dave Grigorka on your VentMI project there. It was really
Yeah.
fascinating. And you solved a problem that other splitters totally couldn't handle. So, I encourage people to go back and look at that episode 6. But one of the things I'm so encouraged to see innovation in medicine being introduced, especially in Michigan. And so one of the things I'm wondering, are you incorporating any of the med ICOR stuff that Jonathan Fay has brought on board into your projects?
Absolutely. We do it in two ways. One is anytime we have a faculty inventor or a grad student inventor, so Wayne State intellectual property is involved, we point them to those resources. We've had people both participate in the regional ICOR, participate in the fast pace, and then we've had some that have gone on to participate in the NSF ICOR. So that's very interwoven into the way that we approach it. And then on a across the table type of approach, a lot of what I do with faculty members is coach them with those same tools applied to where they are in the process. So it becomes a little more customized for them, but very consistent with the overall approach.
Yeah, that was such a terrific innovation, because I was on the very second ICOR NSF thing, and it was impossible for a clinician to participate in that. So yeah, that was really a valuable thing that they did there. And the other thing that occurs to me is that much like there's an executive MBA program in many things, honest to God, Gene, you have 91 episodes out there, and you could group those and for even the medical students that, say they can't get into the MD, MDA program or something like that, honest to God, you could have an executive MBA tutorial, thing there with all your episodes that are
Well,
through
A
there.
new revenue line.
We've heard from quite a few educators that they like to use them and put them out there for their students. It's not the first time we've heard. We use it for required viewing. So no, that's great, Ken. Appreciate your comments and question there. We're coming quickly to the top of the hour. I wanted to get your guys' thoughts on customer discovery because that's where our next series is going. We're not going to have time for that today. But let me give you each just about 10 seconds to just give our audience your final thoughts on this new initiative.
On this new initiative, well, the students are our customers, so this whole process that we've been driving through is still sort of in process, and so we're going to just keep iterating on this thing until we get better and better at it. We're just sort of practice what we preach.
Yeah,
Awesome.
and I would say it's one of the most encouraging things is to see the student interest. Because I think what I've learned from my 20 years in this community is that when the students have interest in something, then things get done. It can't be pushed. It's got to be on a pull basis. So I'm thrilled to see that this is happening.
Yep.
Scott Olson, Jeff Stoltman, thank you for being with me today.
Thank you, Gene.
Very welcome. Thank you for having us.
Really enjoyed it. Next week, we will have a special show in concert with Mish Bio. Stephen Rapundelow is going to be joining me. We are going to be talking about updates from FDA, both their guidance updates, and Stephen is going to be providing us with legislative updates. So stay tuned for that one. After that, we start the Market and Customer Discovery series. That'll be our next series here on MedTech Crossroads. You've heard how important that is. We're going to get into some of the details, including one of those episodes. Jonathan Fay will be joining us again to talk about iCore, because I know you all wanted to hear that. We teased you with it, but we didn't go there. So we'll be talking with Jonathan and many more during the Market and Customer Discovery series. With that, have a great weekend, a great week, and we'll see you next Friday on MedTech Crossroads. Thanks a lot.